So, Emma, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited.
If you don't mind, I would love to start with just a little bit of your story, like why you're interested in this work. I kind of like to start with that. Like what brings you to this? Why is it something you're passionate about?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I grew up in a very sex negative household in the sense that it was very traditional evangelical. My parents, even though I'm Asian, my parents are Italian Americans that are, converters to Christianity. And so really, sex was not discussed a lot. And when you have more unconventional sex desires, like when you're watching Aladdin, as a young child and wondering like, what would it be like to get kidnapped by Jafar? You certainly think, oh, if there's something wrong with regular sex, there's certainly something wrong with me. So, growing up and dealing with those feelings, as I grew away from the church and started to experiment, it still wasn't smooth sailing because now I had this a whole additional dimension to sexuality to contend with. And, being Asian and having stereotypes about like a submissive Asian woman, and then, being a sexually submissive Asian woman, it was very, very complicated to explain to my partners what I wanted them to do without them getting sort of the wrong idea about me or just not being able to, do what I wanted from them.
Mm,
So, I struggled with this. I, grew more into my own. I explored, I found a lot of solace in creative routes where there were like romance novels that kind of had that like tension that I wanted. There was like so much love and passion there, but there were, there's these elements of intrigue. And so I kind of hung on to that. And then fast forward to me being able to get married and explore it on my own and kind of becoming a sex word in my own circles as people were starting to branch out and saying, hey, what's this about? Like, what do I do after I tie someone up? Realizing like, hey, I have a lot of I've accumulated a lot of wisdom from both the creative side of looking at like what the fantasy is supposed to look like, and then, working it out for myself, and now having this wonderful playground of my marriage to actually explore these things, realizing like so many people could benefit from, having practical assistance to get their ideal a little bit closer to reality.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So in this episode, we're talking about how to help couples maybe explore kink. And I guess I also want to start with how do you even define kink? Is it just
Yeah,
something stranger than what I already do? Or like,
yeah.
how do we define this?
Yeah, I mean, so the definition of kink technically encompasses any sexual desire that's considered unconventional. And that's like a terrible
I
definition.
was going to say
It's
unconventional by
circular.
whose
It's circular.
standard? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, what realistically, we also have like, what do people usually mean when they're talking about kink? And most of the time, they're talking about either something within the realm of BDSM or they're talking about some other fetish that may or may not be adjacent to BDSM. So I use kink to describe BDSM also because I'm not a huge fan of the like term BDSM because it sounds so intimidating.
Yeah. Yeah.
Kink is, seems softer. So I think I like to use kink. I almost always mean BDSM when I'm talking about kink or roleplay, which is also adjacent in its own way.
Okay. And I mean, I was going to ask, why would somebody be interested in exploring kink? But I think I wonder, do people already know, in your experience, they already know they're interested in kink and are just looking for a way to explore it? Or is this something maybe somebody's never ever thought about before and there'd still be some benefit in
Yeah.
looking at this?
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. I think it's like a lot of things. I think it's a spectrum. Um, I feel very much that the way that people often know they're interested in kink, it is a process of them understanding it. It's a lot of times I've actually heard from a lot of people, similar to me, it's like a movie they watch that is not considered sexual in any way, that might even be considered, friendly to children. And they see a dynamic in it or something happens to a character and then, what something magical happens when we're witnessing like real storytelling, right? Where we're engrossed, we're in this character's world, we're feeling their feelings, we're crying if bad things happen to them. And so I think we're just vulnerable in a way, and we may not be able to be vulnerable with ourselves when we're, kind of have that separation. And so I think that people will often say, there's this movie character, I had such a big crush on them. And I just, like I kept watching it again and again and like why am I so interested in this thing? And then as sometimes hopefully as they go out and start experimenting uh, and learning, what is and isn't sexual and having these experiences, they can start to make connections. But I mean, it's not A to B because so much of what we, I will take porn for example. So much of what is displayed in porn resembles nothing like the dynamic you actually, want to enjoy with someone or that you actually are having with someone. So sometimes you'll say, "Oh, well, I'm looking at this literal example and I don't feel a thing."
Mm,
So, maybe that's not for me. But realizing like there are so many flavors and that the flavors really matter. There's so many different lenses. The right person matters, so I would absolutely not say if you had a stirring and then you've been like, well, I had this one experience and it really wasn't what I wanted, that does not, I don't think that means, from my personal experience, I would not say that that means count yourself out.
right. Don't throw the baby out with the
Don't
bathwater,
throw the baby
right?
out with the bathwater.
Yeah. All right. So you're saying an awful lot of people have some sort of stirring or some sort of reaction to something that maybe isn't even sexual. And they
Yes.
have that, they maybe have that awareness of themselves, right? There's a little
Mhm.
bit of a curiosity or an experience that they know.
Yes.
Okay. And how, what happens if their partner does not? Like somebody's in a relationship and they've got these kink interests or identity, however you frase it, right? How do they bring it up with a partner who may or may not have a similar interest in kink or exposure to it or, you know, proclivity?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think the first step is kind of knowing where you are with it yourself. Because there's like the concept that we're, I think, both thinking of, right? Is someone says, oh, I really, want to do this. Say it's, being dominated. I really want to be dominated. I wish I could just ask them to like tie me up. And then I'm nervous how they're going to respond to that. And I think that definitely happens. But there's also a lot of other dimensions to that where it may be, I wonder, maybe would I like being dominated? What would it be? What would they have to do to even do it to me, right? For basically where you're not even sure with yourself. So you can't even make
Yeah.
a clear ask. And that's where a lot of times people are exploring things together. And so I think a majority of the time, unless people have a really, really firm thing of like, I've experienced this thing, this is what I like, this is what I want you to do to me. Are you okay with it? I would say that's the less common case. The more
Yeah.
common case is I might like something in this neighborhood, let's explore it. And that can actually be in some ways a little bit more of a load off because you're not saying, hey, please rise and meet my expectation. You're saying, hey, can you help me learn this about myself? And so I think there's a little bit more openness. Now, even given all of that, I would say that uh, there are a lot of different layers and dimensions to why people like what they like. And that is a gift in a lot of ways because you can do something with someone and it can mean one thing for them and it can mean a different thing for you and you can communicate that can be out in the open. For example, someone could say, hey, I'm happy to like be the one in charge from a domination perspective, but I really don't like the idea of me forcing you even in a fantasy universe. I don't feel comfortable with that. I want to feel desired, and luckily, like for some people, they do want some kind of forced fantasy, but there's also many, many layers to the domination where it's not about that, where it's like, okay, I might have liked that flavor, but we can also do all the flavors that are about you really taking care of me, or you really protecting me, or you really, being so full of desire, you want to serve me up on a platter like a Christmas ham, And so there's a lot that you can dig into to kind of sort through those layers as you get more into it of like, we can do this because this is a part you like, and this is a part that I like. If it's just simply, you know, yes or no, then you get more of a case where, oh no, they said yes and I said no. Um,
Right, 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 right. Yeah, it's way more nuanced, right? Because if somebody, I mean, I talk to my clients about this too, because you could say, I want you to spank me,
mm,
but there's zillions of different flavors of that. How hard and where and what are you saying? What's that? How are you acting? What's our relationship, right? Like how there's a, it's not as simple as, am I being spanked or not?
Yeah. And then I would also even add to a layer of like, as you know, I mean, like, who am I talking to, right? Sexuality is so complex.
Yeah,
And there's a lot of elements of like what we like based on what we experienced, what we like based on what we think about ourselves, and what we think of the kinds of things we want to do. And that I think is something that's very like near and dear to my heart and a big reason I wanted to come on the show and talk about it, which is I think that in my opinion, like BDSM has become so much more mainstream, but still has kind of like, I would call it a stinky reputation, in terms of really feeling like it's on the periphery or that, it's so really organized around like strangers doing stuff with each other. And we don't really have a good concept as a society of like what that looks like in a loving partnership
Mm,
thing, like the spectrum of how people might want to do it or not do it. And so when you have that kind of part thrown into the mix, you might be thinking of a certain way that it's going to look and not like the aesthetic of that, not like the idea of like yourself in a dungeon, for example. And that really, doesn't mean much, but if that's what you're stuck on, if that's the like visual aesthetic you're stuck on, that can be really hard. So with what we're working on with Saturday Box, we really try to bring a different aesthetic to the same like kink and love, right? But we have we had like a boss secretary box. We're working right now on like a fairy hunter box. We've done like spy interrogator, and it's supposed to be, trying to conjure up more familiar, like love
mm.
story type things. Because for me, like I'll let you in on a secret, I'm not a huge fan of the main like aesthetic of kink, though I would say I'm quite kinky on the scale of people.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I'd imagine that porn is where we get a lot of these images that we might get locked into. It looks like a dungeon, or it looks like,
Yes.
looks like this thing that we see portrayed, and we don't realize the variety there might be.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
interesting. I would say like my usage, I would say I probably consume very little traditional porn, if any. Whereas I much prefer, romance novels or, smut, as you say. And the reason it's not one, I am a little bit less of a visual person, that's true, but that's not the main reason. And it's really because of the gaze in which, they're exploring in porn, especially for BDSM. It's like unwatchable to me. It's not
Mm,
that like too hardcore. It's just to me, it's like, what's the point? It does
yeah.
not, I don't get any of the sense of like the tension or the desire. It's like, we're putting on this weird costume and then we're like having, porn sex, which is not even very, sensual or loving or anything.
Right.
So I definitely think that, when that's your idea of it, if you look at it, I totally understand why people are like, is this just violence against women? You do not get the sense of like the woman as being an agent of her own, desiring this, which many women do. So it
Right.
kind of creates a bad cultural messaging there as well.
Yeah. And what's the role of learning or exploring some of this independently, like in our own head, understanding our erotic interests versus should we explore it from the very beginning with a partner? Like, like I don't know. Does that question make sense?
No, absolutely. I definitely think the solo exploration is important because there's always like we all have a little bit of a people pleaser inside of us, I think. And when I like even watch a movie, we're talking completely non-sexual. We're just talking about regular movie. I watch a movie with my husband. I'm looking over at him, trying to read like, is he enjoying the movie? Does he like this movie? Um, and meanwhile, when I'm watching something for myself, I'm just saying, do I like this movie? You
Mm,
And so I do think there is a certain amount of non-judgmentality that you can invoke in yourself when you're exploring something on your own. But I would say there can be, and I don't want to catastrophize, but I'll say very softly, there can be a little bit of a danger, I think, when you're only exploring solo, because like with the you've seen like the trends on book talk, like the book boyfriend, your man could never, can become this like sense of, are we reaching this ideal of a person who we might not even want to be in a relationship with, might not actually even want to have any kind of encounter with? Are they becoming this ideal for us because they're doing the exact right movie thing? So we want to always
mm,
like kind of be tethered to that. And I think the more you get down a specific hole of the way your partner needs to fit in, the more you have that fear that they're not going to fit in. So I think bringing people kind of into the process and kind of intermixing those things, you have a little exploration with you have a little bit of like grounding almost, with a partner. I think that can be good. And we hear it more when we talk about, obviously, for example, porn, where there's a concern that like men's whole palette is being defined by stuff that just is simply not real. We talk about that on the male side, but I think there's also some risk as well on the female side,
yeah.
impossible dashing heroes, that are essentially, not real people themselves, that are really just there to satisfy the female MC, to come in and save the day and to, do nothing all day but ravish her. Like,
Right.
there's some, there we have to recognize the same shoe is on a different foot.
Yes. Yes. So is there any reason to to wonder why we're interested in the things we're interested in. Is that part of your exploration at all about like why am I submissive or why does it mean anything or does it matter at all
Yeah,
where this comes from?
I think it matters a lot because I do think, you know, well, basically, let's talk about like the negative reasons people might think you might be into it and how true are they? So the two big ones I think are is we'll talk about submission because that's where I'm at, so I can speak to that better. Um, is it from a place of insecurity and the messaging that we get as women that we're not supposed to be able to ask for pleasure and that it needs to kind of be forced upon us, right? That's kind of one dimension of it. And then the second dimension that people frequently reference, especially when it comes to any sort of like forced sex fantasy, is it a result of trauma
Hmm.
and response to trauma? So I would say that those things can be true. Um, but I don't think that that's the whole story. And I think it's
Yeah.
important to talk about the other reasons that people may be interested in this, because if those two things, that's not maybe a way you want to conceive yourself, or maybe you don't relate to that. And then you're like, then you're going through the whole deep mind psychology to figure out why. I think that there is, to me, a really, really pivotal third that I think is part of it so strongly has to do, well, okay, I came up with two more. First third is um, the concept of how we see women in culture and like historically where they are these objects of desire, where we have these social roles and we aspire like to a princess or a queen or someone who, like Helen of Troy, right, is so beloved that there's a war started over her. So I think simply a lot of the submissive roles really just track alongside that,
Mm.
really are about just like we don't think it's strange when a man has a fantasy about being king and surrounded by women. It's the same thing, right? So it's like if we look at women's historical roles, which have been that of the object or being oppressed, the most powerful women were basically taking that position and making the most of it. They were utilizing it. And so I think that there's just the normal, sexual power fantasy, but because of women's role, it tends to be submissive. So I think that there's an element of that. That's one. And then the second one, for me, has to do with uh, being very confident and assertive and being really always on. I think a lot of women can relate to that, carrying a ton of emotional labor. And then when you get to be submissive, oh man, you get to trust someone else, someone who you can trust them to be paying attention to you, to be anticipating your needs. It is the song and dance of trying to make sure you're being responsive and trying to make sure you're not crossing any boundaries and coming up with inventive new things to do. So I think there's a lot that more, very powerful, confident, assertive women can also very much enjoy about submission because it is a time where you can be vulnerable with this one person who hopefully sees you in the entirety, is not going to say, oh, secretly the whole time, you were just like a little weakling under there, right? So being
Right,
able
right,
to
right.
show your soft belly to maybe the one person you feel comfortable when you feel like you have to be so strong for the world. And so I think that, not to knock on those first two things, but when you have that kind of breadth of reasoning, you start to say, oh, there's a ton of reasons. It doesn't say something negative about me as a person.
Yeah.
It's just part of like the tapestry of humanity that makes me complex and interesting.
And it is certainly not unusual in my experience talking to people about whatever they find erotically interesting, that it's sort of the opposite of how they show up in real life, right?
Yeah,
It's not, whichever direction it is. Often the thing people are turned on by is somehow like almost ego dystonic for people. It's like, wait, this is
yes.
not who I am. I mean, sometimes it's upsetting to people, but it
Yeah.
is it is a chance to be in a different kind of energy.
Well, I tell people, if they want really concrete tips on how you could probably guess someone is submissive, which this is only, only anecdotal, only from my own instinct. The two tops are one, raised religious, not religious anymore. That's going to be a big one. And two, some sort of ADD or ADHD. And I think that like that's funny because I think that those really incorporate the things I was mentioning, right? And the ADHD is a version of like, my mind is going, my mind is going. If somebody's not telling me what to do, I'm not going to be able to focus on my own pleasure, right? And that's so different than the
Huh.
messaging that we hear about kink, where it's like, or 50 Shades of Grey, where it's like his mother burned cigarettes into him, so now he's in, right? That's
Yeah.
completely different. Is I need to focus, is I need a fidget toy, basically.
So how can you speak to the benefits of how this helps a couple connect with each other to sort of explore these fantasies or these interests together?
Yeah.
I imagine it would be really potentially really connecting.
Yeah, I mean, I think we talked about the first thing a little bit, which is, the vulnerability, which is, when you have this thing that you are sharing with this one person. Now, I'm an oversharer, so I tell people my business, but it's quite different to even tell someone, your friend, your best friend, this is what I like, than to be able to experience it with someone. And it's extremely vulnerable, to make the mistakes and to say, hey, we didn't do this perfectly, but it was still good. It can be such a like, team building exercise. It can be a communication thing. And then on top of that, I really always like to talk about cultivating a sense of play, which is kind of that eternal struggle, especially with long term couples, where you're like, hey, what are we going to do? We're not even talking about fire in the bedroom. We're just talking about like, what are we doing tonight? Is it a movie? Are we going out to dinner? So this is like a way in which you can kind of connect to your inner child or just to have some fun with someone and have a
Mm.
thing that we can build on. Like I have a lot of I call them bits, bits that I do with my husband. They're not, and this is not even sexual. It's just like, oh, you know this somebody like left crumbs on the table, who could it have been? Maybe like we have to launch a full investigation. I think when you're able to kind of have that level of you know almost like role play, but just play in your relationship, I think it becomes even the most mundane things can feel special with this person.
Yeah. Yeah. To me too, there's a part of can we welcome all of each other?
Yes.
Like if you have a part of yourself that's kinky and you don't share that or explore that, I don't know, there's a divide a little bit, right? Like there's part of me I'm keeping back.
Yeah. And I think it's really important, when you talk about relationships, you're always talking about power dynamics realistically. Like, when we talk about, oh, who gets to be in charge of this, who gets to make the decisions. And as we've mentioned, it can be kind of ego dystonic. It is a great way to welcome in different dynamics and to be more cognizant of the dynamics that are there,
Yeah.
especially when we talk about people, the next level of this of like other than just, exploring what you like sexually, does this bleed into you to your relationship? Are you, practicing what they call lifestyle BDSM, which is also a spectrum? And how does that make you feel? Like, do you like someone being able to be, in charge of, like say the TV remote? Does it give you a little thrill that they're getting this control over you, or is it making you feel like you live in your parents' house? And I think being aware, always like awareness to me is good, because then you can say, hey, this is a way in which I want you to lead me. This is a way in which I want to lead you. This is a way in which I really feel like we, need to have open and honest, equal communication. And then, I think you're getting closer and closer to that when you can call that out.
Yeah. Yeah. Now you mentioned that role play is somewhat adjacent to this. Like how does role play fit into this? Is that just a way to explore these power dynamics or is it its own
Yeah.
interest?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is its own interest, but it's also part of this, because it's funny, there are people that are self-conscious about kink that are not self-conscious about role play, and there are people that are self-conscious about role play that are not self-conscious about kink, because again, it's like what we're picturing, and so with role play, probably your listeners are thinking of like it's costumes, or with Modern Family, maybe we're pretending to be strangers at a bar or something. But to me, it's kind of like a circle, like all role play in some ways is a bigger circle. I guess it's a Venn diagram, but it's mostly interlocking circles, because kink, any situation, because you are free and you're your own person, any situation where you're ceding power, which you never completely cede because you always have the right to withdraw your consent at any time, you're role playing, because someone doesn't have the right to tell you what to do or to punish
Mm,
you or to spank you, right? And so I think that when you can kind of think of it that way, it takes off some of the edge. What people are nervous about with role play is the acting component. They're like, oh, like they're afraid, of making a fool of themselves. Where I think with kink, there's a little bit more of this perceived mechanical element of like, well, how wrong can I be when it comes to spanking someone? Although the answer is you can be quite
pretty
wrong.
wrong. Yeah.
Totally can be. So I think it's in some ways just a perception. I don't really know that there's a really difference in difficulty, but that's where, being able to recognize the way in which you're playing, even inside and outside the bedroom, I think can help take the barriers down for both of those things. And
Yeah.
it's, being willing to say, hey, you know what? Sometimes like I'm gonna say a thing that's totally gonna take us out of the mood, or sometimes, I'm gonna fart, and that's gonna take us out of the mood. And then saying, guess what? That's okay. it was still sexy. It was still like we were able to laugh in the middle of it. And actually, it still really scratched that itch. I think when you can get over the idea that like you have to have a perfect experience to have a wonderful experience, like that is the route to happiness.
Yeah, 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 yeah. And do you usually advise people talk like ahead of time about everything that's going to happen, and so we're clear in the middle, like, wait, could you do this differently? Or wait till the end and debrief it, like, oh, that didn't go so well, or it went great. Like
Yeah.
where's the role of conversation and talking about let's make sure this really fits us.
Well, like a lot of things, right? It's person to person. So me, I like love the anticipation. I love the buildup, So I really like to think like, oh, we're gonna do this and we're gonna do this. But I also like to be surprised. So, even within myself, I'm a mixed bag. My husband, for example, he definitely likes to plan. But if we talk too much about specifically what we're gonna do, it takes some of the like spontaneity out of him. He doesn't want me to see like his whole hand, right? And so I think really knowing the complexity of what you're going to do kind of informs you on like what level of awareness. In a role play, for example, you unless somebody's really good at just kind of yes anding, you need to know, hey, in advance, like what is your role? If is this
Yeah.
person a pirate, is this person a princess? Like you do need to know. But with some kink stuff, it is a little bit simpler. Is it just, I'm gonna like restrain your hands while we watch a show together? But I do think it is a good idea to get a sense of like about how long are we planning to do this? What's the best way for me to signal to you that I'm kind of done with this, right? Which we talk about when it comes to a specific sexual encounter, but we don't always talk about just when it comes to, sort of play. Like some people, for example, like me, I don't want any kind of affection of any sort while I'm cooking. I need 100% to focus, So I would be very miffed if something like this is continuing and then I have to cook. I'm like not trying to yes sir anyone while I'm cooking. I am like yes sirring the recipe. That is like the only thing on my mind.
Yeah. So I think the answer is sort of all of the above, right? Some conversation ahead of time, some probably in the middle if something, especially if you need something to stop, and then
Yes,
some conversation after about how did this go, what worked, what didn't work, what would we want to do
yes.
differently. Okay.
And the more you do it, I think the more you get a sense of like, hey, is this going to be one fun, quick thing for us? Are we feeling like we have a day where we can be extra sexy? You get a sense of where it fits in the schedule. And I love like anticipation that no one minds is talking about like how excited you're going to be about that and getting into the headspace. Because the trouble with planning ahead sometimes can be if you get to it and you don't really feel like doing it, then
Yeah.
there's that next bit. So it's really about like, how do we get to be in a good place for that? And then through that, you are kind of working out some of those details.
Yeah. All right. So talk to us a little bit about Saturday Box and how this could help couples explore, some
Yes.
of these kink
Um,
dynamics.
yeah, so I mean, all the hard work that we discussed, we try to take like 60 to 80% of that off of you. But that's good. Um, and we're basically a service that creates these adventures for couples to kind of explore their kinky side. We start with classic fantasies, like some of I mentioned earlier, boss secretary, spy interrogator. We have a prison warden one, and we're working on fairy hunter. So that they can kind of take on the roles of these characters, however much role playing they want to do, and have an activity, a clearly defined activity with a ton of variations to dive right in. So we're kind of, like almost an adult at home escape room. It's like a bunch of stuff. You get like props, you get lingerie, you get all these cards to guide you, you get character cards to kind of tell you who to be. So it's supposed to feel more like a game. And we really strongly feel like when you're playing, it's so much easier to accept mistakes, to be delighted, to take the pressure off of yourself rather than something that's really asking you, sit here, learn these terms, like check this list. So it's kind of a different approach to this.
And where do people learn more I guess it's a subscription kind of thing?
Yeah, so we just started a subscription. We do have it, one time if you want to try it for like an anniversary or a birthday or just like a weekend when the kids are not there. So you can get it on our website, SaturdayBox.com. And you can also follow us on Instagram, that's Saturday_box. And that's mostly just me doing silly things. But if you like me doing silly things, then that's the place for you.
Well, cool. Well, thank you so much for being here.
Yes, thank you for having me.